anthology called Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction. And the term was an homage to the work of Alondra Nelson, who worked in Afrofuturism, which is talking about how Black culture relates to tech, and then also to the Black diaspora. And I want to point out that Dylan notes that the term is pluralized. We do this because we want to acknowledge that there are multiple different Indigenous nations, cultures, and perspectives. So we always use futurisms as opposed to futurism, because we don't want to ever monolithize Indigenous cultures. So the really simple, easy definition of Indigenous futurism is when you put Indigenous voices into media, whether that's books, film, or art, and that gives us Indigenous perspectives on the past, present, and the future. The initial categories that Grace Dillon defined are up on the screen here. We have the native slipstream. So slipstream talks about like space and time narratives. We have contact, which I think is pretty obvious. It's the contact between two cultures. We have Indigenous science and sustainability, so that's Indigenous knowledges, native apocalypse, and the Biskabiang, which is an Ojibwe word. It means returning to ourselves, and you can think of it as being similar to decolonial work. So you can see clearly how these different categories overlap with each other. None of them are discrete. They all have various relationships. It's impossible for us to decolonize without reconciling or embracing the other categories. So contact is inextricably linked to native apocalypse in our history. And then also slipstream, we can use that to imagine alternative pasts and futures in combination with the other categories of apocalypse, decolonization, traditional science or knowledges, and then other forms of contact, because contact doesn't just reference settler Indigenous contact. It can be Indigenous, or contact could happen on Mars. So the reason we're talking about Indigenous futurism today is because I want to talk about the example of coyote and crow. And we're going to talk about how coyote and crow specifically fits those categories. And I think it's just a really good example. So does it take place in slipstream? Yeah, absolutely. It takes place in an alternative timeline. In Coyote and Crow, there's an apocalyptic event that happens roughly 500 years or so ago that throws Northern Turtle Island, or Northern American continent, into an ice age and prevents the cultural sort of cross contamination or an exchange of ideas that happens with Europe and then also with Asia. So contact happens between other Indigenous cultures, but it doesn't happen with settlers. And that means that Coyote and Crow engages with settler contact through its overt absence. So by looking at the absence of that contact, we can see the shape of it. And then in terms of Indigenous knowledge, Coyote and Crow highlights Indigenous capability and possibilities. So it is a solar punk setting. Some people often complain that Coyote and Crow then becomes a utopia. And I think that you'll find if you read the books, there's lots of political intrigue. There's still issues with resource access. And just because you've solved one or two technological issues doesn't mean that suddenly your world is turned into a utopia. So there is Indigenous knowledge, but that doesn't mean that it's a world without problems or challenges or, fights, combat, monsters. Native apocalypse. So obviously the apocalyptic event prevented the intercultural dialogue across oceans, and it changed Indigenous histories. So it checks that category too. And then in terms of Biskabiang, Coyote and Crow, because there is no settler colonial contact, doesn't necessarily engage with that directly, but it encourages readers and gamers to consider concepts that didn't originate in Western thought, and in that way you can use it as a decolonial tool. But why even bother connecting to the past? Why not just make a book that goes from now into the future and takes a different path from today? Why set the divergence in the past? Well, it's a movement called Futurisms, but it's deeply rooted, deeply embedded in the past, and narratives that reference our traditional knowledges. And I suspect the answer is really complex and multifaceted, but I can give a couple of perspectives that I think have maybe something to do with why we so often see the past reference in Indigenous futurism. So every colonial act perpetuated every day, everywhere is a microcosmic recontact. You are reliving it in a smaller form. So therefore, contact is intimately present in our present. So the past is always here with us. Indigenous people have transitioned through and overcome trauma, subjugation, victimization, and through recapitulation, through going through the stories again, and we can live them again or talk about them with like a gritty, defiant, jubilant Indigenous joy, and that references something called survivance, which is showing that we're not just here, we're also thriving, we're also going to tell our stories. There's also the aspect of education. So there's been a lot of false narratives or Eurocentric narratives around contact or the past. And it's only relatively recently that we're starting to see non-European narratives within our education system. And additionally, Indigenous concepts of time and stewardship are quite different than Western concepts of time. And I'm going to go into that a little bit further. But just in sort of short form quickly, it engages with some of our nations have 7th-generation thinking, and there's also the knowledge that the past repeats until cycles are broken. And then I think probably one of the biggest reasons we continue to return to these narratives is stolen futures. So contact almost stole our future entirely. It changed the courses of all of our lives, but it very, very much came with an aspect of genocide and cultural denial, and for a long time any narratives that included Indigenous people didn't have positive futures. And so I believe that contact is probably needed to be successfully renegotiated in order for us to move forward in a way that is healthy and good for us all. Part of the issue with our two different perspectives is that Western thought comes with a lot of either or. So duality and a lack of hybridity or relationality is a long-standing feature of Eurocentric thought, and you can thank essentialism and the Greeks for that, so thank you. But some of the examples would be in Western thought, mind and body are separate. Good and bad, woman and man, white or other, past, present, future, they're all distinct. They're all distinct and separate entities, but there's little indication that that kind of black and white thinking existed in the deeply relational worldviews of most Indigenous nations of Turtle Island. In Western culture, for example, I'm considered half Cree Métis and then also half settler, but if I talk to like my Cree elders, then I'm considered more. I'm considered a hybrid, I'm considered whole. I am Cree and I am also Carly Lloyd. So to return to Western concepts of time, Western chronology is deeply linked to the idea of progress. And you can thank philosophers like Rousseau and Condorcet, who came up with the idea that you can perfect a human being. And then guys like Turgot, who then took that further and said, if you can perfect a human, then you can perfect a man. That means that you can perfect society, economy, and religion. And then also a philosopher that had a huge impact in Western thought is Hegel. And as far as history was concerned, he believed that we should only ever look back if we want to be grateful, and that's the only purpose of history. In Western chronology, time moves only as an arrow, only as a line. So we go from good, better, to best, and then eventually it will end. There's an end point in the timeline, theoretically. But in Indigenous chronologies, time isn't necessarily an arrow. It doesn't have a beginning and an end. Specifically, when I was doing this presentation, I'm referencing the Eastern Cree and Northern Quebec and the ontologies that they have. But that's mostly just because it's so hard to find academic references that have applicable examples, because it is hard to find cases where elders have been interviewed and their opinions documented. But in my culture, time is considered cyclical, and when you look at a cycle from a longer perspective, you'll see a spiral. And from a certain perspective, if you look at the lines of the spiral, you'll see that they overlap. Why is that important? Well, in Western thought, we never include the past or the present into movements concerning the future because Western thought separates them into different things. But when we center Indigenous knowledges, we can see in alternative views that the past, present, and future are interwoven and that they affect each other. To observe the past changes the present and allows new directions in the future, and to imagine the future gives new perspectives on the past. By centering Indigenous science knowledges, we return to ourselves bringing benefits that can be shared by all. So who benefits from Indigenous Futurism's contentious grappling with the past? Well, probably everyone. Obviously, reconnecting Indigenous people, that's a really obvious one. They've had their cultural inheritances and understandings disrupted by contact. But everybody is affected by colonialism. It's deeply linked to capitalism, othering, modernity, unhealthy uses of technology, our environmental disasters, the list goes on. And I think it's obvious that the Western culture hasn't been working for the common person for a long time. But by examining our past and considering unfamiliar knowledge and moving in new directions, we can potentially create paths that we wouldn't have access to otherwise. And I think that that's infinitely more value than just continuing to do what we've been doing over and over. So if you're going to take anything away from this, I would love that you understand the categories of Indigenous Futurism so you can identify it. But I think the core message is that when we're talking about Indigenous Futurisms, we have to go back to the future. So you have to go back to the past and understand it before you can move forward. And then I've just got some examples of illustrations that I've done for Coyote and Crow. And we'll go through them real quick, and then I'll take any questions about illustrating for TTRPGs or working on Coyote and Crow or any of the other books I've worked on. So this is an image that is the Awis. So you'll see this in the Coyote and Crow source book. It depicts the events that happened after the apocalyptic event that separates North America and South America from the rest of the globe. This is an image called Bear Festival. So I specifically wanted to include a two-spirit romance when I was illustrating for this book. As I said, my practice really centers like deprivileged individuals. So we have a young man who is engaging in a courtship ritual with a two-spirit person here in purple. And you'll also notice they have a cyborg arm because when you're doing solar punk narratives, you can have robot arms. But we've also got some elders in the back. So you'll notice in the top right there, we've got an elder with his feathers and his peace pipe. So there's still aspects of like our culture that would come through into an alternative future because it's still based on the same source past. So even though it's evolved into a different sort of leg on the timeline, you'll still see some familiar references, although there are no specific nations that are represented because it is a different timeline and obviously our cultures would have developed differently. There are spirits or beings in the world that are unusual or maybe a little bit harder to parse. Whether or not they are a good or a bad guy, well, that's a Western binary. We already discussed that. I think we have to move past ideas of just good or bad, and we have to start considering the perspectives of the natural being that we're talking about. So is it true that this is a monster? Maybe not. This is one of my favorite images that I did. It's called Tipaskawi Pisim, or Pascual Mostos Tipaskawi Pisim. It's called Buffalo Moon. I was asked to do a horror piece, and when I thought about what horror meant to me as an Indigenous person, I thought about like culpability and responsibility, and I wanted it to be unclear as to whether this young person who has removed a stone from the medicine wheel, whether that is something that is causing the buffalo to come out and mutate, or whether they're the protectors and guardians, and this is an interloper. And I think it gives you a more complex narrative to work with, and you can potentially come up with some different stories to tell around that. And so all the artwork in the book is considered from that aspect of, what do I, as an Indigenous person, what's my perspective on it, and how can I relate that to you? This particular piece was called, I think it's called Hero. I was asked to produce a heroic image. And when I thought about what heroes and quests meant to me, I didn't necessarily think of warriors. Like, yes, there's someone going on a quest, but who's braver? The person who leaves or the person who has to stay? And I thought about the different kinds of challenges we go through life. And birth giving is a really big moment in a lot of lives. And so I wanted to depict two different sides of heroism, essentially. I've also done other TTRPG work. So this is work from Land of a Thousand Nations, which is Seventh Seas, which is Chaosium. It takes place further south, so you'll see some different sort of cultural markers. It also takes place on the East Coast, so you'll see that I draw inspirations from some Mi'kmaq patterning as well. And the spirits and beings represented make reference to cultures that exist for this particular narrative, so you have to make sure you're doing it in a respectful way. And that means doing a lot of research and talking to people from that culture, so that you understand what you can and can't depict and what you need to do to be accurate. We have a story about Thunderbird's egg being stolen, and this is just one particular depiction of water panther. There are lots of Algonquin cultures that have this being, the underwater panther, and you'll find there's lots of different depictions of what it might look like. This is just one. And then we also have badger and otter teaching the Haudenosaunee how to make nets, which is also how we got lacrosse. This is a dream powwow. So medicine users or medicine men come together in a powwow as part of this story. Again, you have to make sure that when you're translating cultural elements into like TTRPG, that you're doing it in a respectful way, that it's in a positive way. No one here is depicted in a way that's derogatory. Everyone is depicted very thoughtfully. They'll have spirit companions that are animals. So you'll see like meaningful things that I've pulled from stories that I love. So Hummingbird is a story that we hear a lot at AU Arts, doing what you can with what you have. So I threw a little hummingbird in there. And we've also got snake, because even though snake is in Western culture often a vilified animal, in Cree culture it represents like knowledge sometimes, depending on which Cree nation you come from, and so I wanted to depict that. And also bears, because I just love drawing bears. I also did work for Thirsty Sword Lesbians, Advanced Lovers and Lesbians, which is the expansion book. This is an alien planet filled with frog people, and Indigenous people have come to this planet and made contact. And they've created a culture of hybridity where everyone gets what they need, and they work and live in tandem with themselves and also with nature. And that's really easy because all the nature on this planet is huge, and it will just step on you if you're not good. I do have a book coming out on October 12th. It's called Lost at Windy River. I'm the colorist. This story is a true story. It happened to Ilse Schweder back in 1944. Unfortunately, Farley Mowat decided to take her story and change a bunch of stuff, and it always upset her, and finally her family was able to tell the story themselves, and so we get to take the story back, reclaim it, and then bring it out. As an illustrator, I also do a lot of character design. This is a project for homework, but illustration is one of the ways that we can tell meaningful stories to each other, and I love drawing elders, not just because I worked in long-term care pharmacy, but also because elders are very important to me culturally. So I know it was a bit brief, but I want to thank you. My work can be found online at nihilisdinosaur.com, and I would encourage everyone to sign up for the Coyote and Crow mailing list. There is news coming out, hopefully quite soon. I can't really talk about it, but I am excited for it. And I would love to give the remaining time that I might have to any questions people might have about Indigenous Futurisms or about illustration. Any questions? Everyone's shy? Okay. I have a question for you guys. Does anyone here want to be an illustrator? Does anyone here want to illustrate specifically for TTRPG? And are you self-taught or have you gone to school? Okay. So I was self-taught for years. I didn't go to school until after I had a car accident and needed to change jobs. Before I went to school, I was already illustrating. I did comics, self-published, which I'm a member of Panel One, which is the comic community here in Calgary. And then I also did my first professional work before I ever went to school. So it is not necessary to go to school, but if you find that you learn best in a structured environment and you want to do networking, it might be worth your time, but you are not required to. You can learn everything that you can learn at school by yourself. But whether or not you will put in the time, unless someone is checking your homework and grading it, is a different question. Do you have any questions about like anything that I've done or any work that I have up there? So to build up storytelling skills, I recommend intaking material rather than producing. Producing should come later. You should know what kind of stories you want to tell, and you should know what kind of illustrating you like to do, because there's so many different kinds. If you very specifically want to work in TTRPG or comics, then yes, you definitely want to have a strong grasp of narrative. You're also going to end up drawing and designing things that you had no idea that you were going to do. So I highly recommend doing a comic first if you can. I would keep it sub 8 pages because that makes it feasible. But when you do a comic, you don't just do the story, you don't just do the visual story, you don't just do like the written dialogue. You're also designing backgrounds, you're designing vehicles, you're designing monsters, you're designing characters. Comics is probably the hardest thing you can do. So if you can do that first, that's a pretty good way. I got into art school because I'd already self-published 2 comics, and when I showed them at portfolio review beforehand, they accepted my portfolio immediately and I didn't have to submit, because comics is the most work you can do. And if you can figure out how to produce and print it, that shows that you are already very capable and you're ahead of a lot of people who are even in their third or fourth year of school, because most students don't leave school with a strong idea of production. And the same thing for TTRPGs. I recommend taking on small projects first. So if you know someone who's pumping out like one-pagers, like one-page games, and they need just a couple of spot illustrations, you're gonna be battling against cheap AI art. But I think that as humans, we value things that have been made more than things that have been produced by a machine without a lot of input or thought. So I know a lot of people are really pessimistic about art going forward in the TTRPG space, but I still see a lot of people who value our work. Yeah. So start small. Take on a comic, but start a small comic. Take on a TTRPG, but start with a small one. Yeah. No, I'm good. I only have one question, so. Thank you, everybody, and thanks again to Sean and to AärdCON for having me, and I hope everyone has a great time. And I'm looking forward to playing Coyote and Crow with Morgan, who is in the white here. You should speak to her if you want to try and snag a seat, because I hear there might be one available.
Well, Jillian, I wanted to say a big thank you. I am so happy to have you here. It was so, like, I know it was relatively short notice, but, like, you're one of the speeches I was most excited for, and I really appreciated you taking the time out of your busy life. We have a little gift from PM Hobbycraft, Easy Roller Dice, and Fenris.
I love it.
And just like the biggest heartfelt thank you.